The Industrial Revolution represents a decisive and definitive break with the pre-modern world. In its wake, economic growth took off exponentially, and the productive potential of humankind was awakened to the extent that practically limitless multiplication of goods was now possible. Beginning roughly in the 1780s, coterminous with the French Revolution, Britain rose to become the world's first industrialized nation. Having come to dominate global trade in the previous century through its oceanic empire, Britain ushered in an era where productivity and access to materials became the twin signifiers of true international political power. All across the country, the economy was being rationalized and social relations transformed. Before the Industrial Revolution, life at the level of the family unit was quite predictable. Change was gradual, and the pace of life was unrushed, conforming to well-worn, pre-established paths. For most people, the hierarchy, which bound tenant farmer to laird, was stable and went largely unchallenged. The most unpredictable forces in pre-modern life were weather, which was fairly accurately forecastable, war, which involved only a fraction of the population, and disease, which was considered a fact of life, not the arbitrary laws of supply and demand. Industrialization shattered all pre-existing norms for the common man. Rents, once fixed for all eternity, began to fluctuate wildly, though generally skyward. Agricultural output had to shoot up to feed swelling manufacturing towns, and people were driven off the land into factories by their thousands. The Industrial Revolution is one of the most important developments in world history, equal to the founding of the first cities and the discovery of agriculture. It inaugurated a new era that we still live in today, even if heavy industry has largely been outsourced to the developing world. Of the two most advanced nations in the world in the 1780s, France certainly had some advantages over Britain that might have prompted it to take the first leap into steam-powered mass production. It had better understanding of scientific theory, particularly chemistry, which was encouraged by institutional academies. Britain, however, had a longer and perhaps even pre-peak Enlightenment tradition of liberal politics, and both economic development and private profit were long accepted as legitimate objects of government policy versus French absolutism. The British also had a lead in per capita trade and commerce in comparison to its competitors, if not in total production. Its achievements in pure science, however, lagged behind the continent. Much more than France, however, in Britain, the route towards influencing the government apparatus was through money, if one lacked aristocratic blood. Class structures were still extremely rigid. The labourers showed deference to lords, and the gentry was comfortable in its superiority. But there was increasing room for the independently wealthy to adopt landed mannerisms, and for aristocrats to dabble in enterprise, such as mining. Britain's greatest advantage, however, was its domination of the world market through a vast oceanic empire. It had unparalleled access to raw materials and international consumers, and its industrial expertise assisted expansion elsewhere. One sector of the economy drove the Industrial Revolution forward like no other: cotton. The cotton industry was intimately linked with the colonial endeavour. Raw material was grown and picked in plantations, predominantly by slaves in North America. It was then processed in British industrial mills and finally sold to captive markets in India. Cotton was originally an indigenous industry of India, where the woven material was known as calico. In the early years of Indian colonialism, the British found cotton to be a superior fabric, and it soon began to replace native wool as the preferred material of choice for clothing. At the end of the 18th century, the mills of Britain began to produce its own cotton, eventually to a superior, more consistent quality than Indian calico, which it sold back to them, dominating the market to the point of dependency. There was a shift from a consuming ruling class to an investing ruling class. Whereas before, the wealthy people in society had been frivolous aristocrats with a taste for and expectation of luxury and leisure, the newly wealthy, produced by industry, were used to saving and being thrifty, so held on to their money much more, or invested it back into their factories and mills. The rising industrialist class kept their money in funds to generate interest, or redirected it towards projects that would make them wealthier. For this reason, they were held in contempt by the middle classes left behind. Complaints and frustrations with this new mode of production were not limited to political activists, however. Capitalists, too, were vexed by the system's boom and bust cycles and its declining profit margins. A major problem for them, though, was that they simply had more money than they knew what to do with. Luckily, this excess capital coincided with another of the greatest technological developments of modern times, the railway. The glut of money accumulated by British industrialists was absorbed by railway mania and used to construct the most comprehensive network in all Europe. Rail travel standardised time across Britain by forcing stations to coordinate arrivals and departures to the precise minute. It shrank the country considerably, and eventually the continent. The building of railways demanded an immense amount of steel and coal, driving the growth of these industries in which the raw materials were to be found domestically and in abundance. Britain's Industrial Revolution smashed the high ceiling of ancient Rome's peak development. The exponential economic growth it launched made a mockery of all that had gone before. Steam power had solved the twin problems of scarce land and expensive muscles. But at the same time, the labour required to industrialise led to the mass desertion of the land for manufacturing towns. All the while, an exploding population was kept fed by agricultural rationalisation. It had happened in Britain and not in France, partly because the latter lost important colonial wars, went on to have a peasant revolution preventing commercialisation of farming, and the petty bourgeoisie held great political influence versus British investors and bankers.